Now, another thriller starring Wesley Snipes and called Passenger 57 was to have been released this week, but for reasons of their own, Warner Brothers have postponed it. This, I can assure you, is no cause for weeping and gnashing of teeth, because it's a pretty ordinary tale, but it's also very violent, and the excessive depiction of violence appears once again to be firmly on the cinema-goer's agenda. Around this time last year, the abundance of mayhem in Martin Scorsese's Cape Fear, and later much of the same in Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, caused a lot of people to ask whether the movies had finally gone too far. And now, just as that little uproar was dying down, along come the black Belgian comedy Man Bites Dog and Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, causing the question to be voiced even more loudly than before. This is not a new issue, of course. People have been arguing about violence ever since the movies began. And in recent decades, films like The Wild Bunch, Bonnie and Clyde, A Clockwork Orange, and The Straw Dogs have raised anguished yells of protest. Pretty soon, I suspect there'll be another outcry when the bloodthirsty Henry, portrait of a serial killer, is released on video, despite the censor James Furman's recent declaration on this program that it would never happen.
We sought expert advice. We showed it to a forensic psychiatrist and 2 forensic psychologists, all of whom knew serial killers very well, had interviewed them at great length, and both here and in the States, where serial killers are much more common than in Britain. And they all felt that while the film had merits and should be seen as cut in the cinema, they thought it would be most unwise to put it out on video, where you can select the scenes you want to see and incorporate a fairly short scene of 5-10 minutes into your personal fantasy. And the idea of somebody, a potential serial killer, watching scenes in this film over and over again in the privacy of a bed sitting room or whatever, was a very disturbing prospect to all 3 of them, and we agreed. And I think it's most unlikely that this film will ever be seen in that form on video under the Video Recordings Act.
Obviously, the censor's misgivings have been overcome, although the video version of Henry has had an additional 48 seconds cut out. Nevertheless, we're entitled to wonder what's going on. Are filmmakers confusing freedom with license? Are films becoming increasingly violent? Well, yes, I think they are, but how much this is a cause for concern depends, as it always has done, on the individual. My own view is that gratuitous violence, violence used purely for titillation, as it is in most formula thrillers, is unpleasant and a sign of both moral bankruptcy and a lack of imagination. I also despise and find worrying the kind of Tom and Jerry violence of films like Home Alone 2, which suggests that hitting a man with an iron bar is fun because he gets up at once, shakes his head, and carries on with his life. But it would be a grave mistake to lump pictures like Unforgiven, Reservoir Dogs, and Man Bites Dog in with silly and unpleasant nonsense like that. In Unforgiven, for example, it's perfectly clear that killing people does something deeply harmful to the killer as well as the killed. In Reservoir Dogs, there is no doubt at all that being shot or tortured hurts. And the dreadful gang rape and murder in Man Bites Dog has the specific purpose of shocking the audience into asking itself what it thinks it's doing, laughing at and enjoying the brutal activities of the protagonist. These films portray violence, but they don't glorify it, and they don't want us to glorify it either. Now, against that, there's the argument that any kind of violence on screen might disturb the young and cause the mentally unbalanced to go out and commit violence themselves. It's a theory that merits consideration, but is, I think, ultimately untenable. If art, in any medium, only concerned itself with what would be harmless to the young or the mentally disturbed, we'd all be reading Beatrix Potter. Nevertheless, I'm encouraged by a report that producers are trying to cut down on violence, if for no more noble reason than that a 12 or 15 certificate attracts a bigger audience. The less gratuitous violence, the better, as long as it doesn't mean that the nature and effects of violence are no longer considered fit subjects for serious filmmakers.